Hello and welcome to Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and this is your mostly weekly deep dive into the English language libraries of the 8 and 16-bit era of home consoles, meaning the scope of the channel is 1275 or so Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X titles. Yeah, still a long way to go. There's a good chance that I'll be on Social Security by the time I'm done. But if it can be played on a Genesis either by itself or via another piece of hardware, like the power base converter, I'm going to attempt to cover it. Of course, there's goofy things out there when you try to have a scope this large, like say the 3D games for the Master System, or Codemasters' issues with failing to make sure their games were compatible with all the consoles they were supposed to be. But I'll figure out some way of dealing with those, I hope. Thankfully, neither of those issues is a problem for today's selection. In fact, California Games is about as basic as it gets when it comes to Zilog and Moto. It's a release for the Genesis that came out in February of 1992, so right in the middle of the console's lifespan, and it's not a terribly valuable game, currently averaging about $20 for a complete copy on price charting. About the only thing to note about its release that was somewhat unusual is that it was released in both North American and PAL markets, but not Japan or any other Asian market. Not sure why, especially since Japan not only got the Master System version, which we'll cover in about another 100 episodes or so, but the Master System version even supported the FM sound module. Maybe it didn't sell well, so they decided a Japanese version of the subsequent Genesis port wasn't worth their time. Who knows? If you're not familiar with California Games, well, then I have to assume that you're a bit younger than me, because it was a wildly popular title from Epyx in the late 80s. The previously mentioned Master System and Genesis versions were two of the later ports of the title, with the Genesis version specifically being the last version of the game released to market, with the US version even lagging a few months behind its debut on the Mega Drive in Europe. Along with those versions, the title was also released for almost all of the home computers at the time, the Commodore 64, which is where I first played it, the Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, Atari ST, Amiga, Apple II GS, DOS, and even the MSX. But probably its most noteworthy non-Sega versions were for the NES and the Atari Lynx, with the Lynx version regarded as one of the best games on the console, which makes sense when you think about how the Lynx was originally developed by Epyx. So, of course, they were going to be able to program for their own console. Finally, for me, the most shocking port of California Games was for the Atari 2600, but not for the reasons you might think. You see, I actually owned that 2600 version of California Games, but I had completely forgotten about it until researching this review. It was startling to see that footage on YouTube and remember, wait, I played that a lot. Let's get this back on track though, as this review isn't for any of those versions of the game, some of which I spent considerable time with. It's for the Genesis version that before this week, I have never played. Or have I? No, for real. This is going to be a first time for me. But since I have played the other versions of it, I'm very curious to see if the Genesis version will hold up to those other ports or not. We shall see if it represents the franchise well, but first, let's take a look at the package with that oh-so-familiar cover art.
And this is my copy of California Games for the Genesis, which has held up extraordinarily well over the years. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's in mint condition, but it is looking very nice, with the hang tab intact at the top of the case, and only the most minor scratching to the outer cover. Also, that outer cover has done its job, and the inner cover has been fully protected with no sun damage, water damage, or edge wear. As far as the cover art goes, I mentioned previously that it looked familiar, and that's because all of the US versions of the game used the same photo for the cover. For instance, here's the rival 8-bit NES and Master System covers. For the European-focused home computers where US Gold was in charge, they got a different cover, and then when Kix did budget re-releases of the title, another piece of art was used. If this is what you were used to growing up, I could understand liking it, especially the US Gold version that makes an effort to showcase all the different events. But as far as I'm concerned, the original photo cover is where it's at, even if Hacky Sack and Frisbee aren't shown. And that logo with the palm tree as the eye in California looks fantastic. I'm really glad that this released during the black cross-hatching era of the Genesis, by the way, as I don't think this cover would have popped nearly as well with red bars on the side. One last thing with the photo cover, you've got to wonder how many copies of the game were sold due to having the girl in the bikini and the roller skates front and center. That's just marketing 101 there, and I'm sure it didn't hurt at all when placed in magazines and electronics boutique ads. Flipping over the back, and at first glance, it definitely looks pretty basic with just black text on white background. If you look closely though, they did try to mix up the background a little though, and there's actually some faint teal waves in there. The 3 screenshots over to the right are all of good quality, and they smartly showed off 3 of the events, with only BMX and hacky sack, or it's referred to in the flavor text, footbag, not shown. And I've just got to stop for a second, but footbag? No one I know ever called it footbag, and I played my share in middle school. That name just sounds incredibly dumb, and I'm kind of surprised no one in marketing was like, wait, we're calling it what now? I'm assuming that's got to be a regional thing, maybe. One other thing that stands out on the rear cover, and it's something that I'm pretty certain only exists on California games. Check out that traditional player indicator graphic in the lower left, and note how it says 1 to 9 players. No, that's not a misprint. California Games does support 9 players competing against one another. More on that when we get to the game review portion. Opening up the case, and the manual is in decent shape. It's got some wear, but certainly it's not the worst I've seen. Also, check out the label on the cartridge. That's a pretty cool design to fill up the space. The manual reads like a pretty standard Genesis first-party manual from the era, first thoroughly explaining all the game options, and there are a few, and then having dedicated sections to each of the 5 sports, how scoring is handled for each, and then tips for how to maximize your potential. Ultimately, you can probably play California games without a manual, but I think a player that actually has the manual and has read it would certainly have an advantage over a player just playing the game cold. Okay, that's the package for California games. Let's pop this in and see how it compares to my memories of the game on other platforms. Modern gamers probably aren't familiar with Epyx, as the company was officially shuttered in 1993. But during the 80s, they were a huge developer of home computer titles on various platforms, with the Commodore 64 being their machine of choice for most of their titles. Which makes sense as it was the most popular of all the 8-bit home computers in both Europe and the United States. And no, I'm not getting into a ZX Spectrum or Amstrad debate here, as I'd be wildly out of my depth. But I do recognize that they both have their fan bases as well. But what happens when you invest heavily in development for a computer platform and it reaches the end of its lifespan and its replacement isn't a viable product in your home country? Well, apparently, if you dislike Nintendo and its time monopolistic practices with developers, which is totally understandable, you decide to create your own console, possibly with blackjack and hookers. This strategy unfortunately didn't work out too well for Epyx, but at least we got the Atari Lynx out of it, so I guess that's nice. Anyway, the whole point is, even if modern gamers may not be familiar with the company, it's hard to dispute their impact on the 8-bit scene, releasing classics like Impossible Mission, Jumpman, Barbarian aka Death Sword, and porting over the original Rogue from BSD. But the series of games that I probably played the most on the Commodore 64 was the Games series, which initially consisted of Summer Games 2, and Winter Games. Each of the titles had you picking a country to represent and then compete in various Olympic sports for the opportunity to bring home the championship for your country. I was all over these games, and as it turns out, this was probably the period in my life that I was most into the Olympics, and these games are probably part of the reason why. But I like all sports, and that includes the, at the time, emerging extreme sports genre that would later be popularized by the X Games. Similar genre games like 720 or Skate or Die were cool, but they were both just focused on skateboarding alone. So if you wanted the variety of something like Summer or Winter Games, you needed to look elsewhere. Epyx saw that opportunity and released California Games, and it was hugely popular, resulting in the game being ported all over the place. However, I've got to admit, even with California Games' popularity on other platforms, I was more than a bit surprised to see this Genesis port, as it was released almost 2.5 years after its last appearance on other consoles, and almost 5 years after it was first released on the Commodore 64. Appearing right in the middle of the 16-bit console revolution, just as the Genesis was approaching its peak, was odd timing for a 5-year-old game to say the least. This was pretty normal for ports from arcade releases, for instance, something like Road Blasters, and it usually worked out well as the Genesis hardware had somewhat caught up to where the arcade boards were previously. But to re-release a formerly 8-bit computer title is really going to require something special from the developers to be noteworthy. If you are familiar with the other versions of California Games, you should feel pretty at home with the Genesis version, which is good and bad, as I'll get to. The overall concept behind the game is no different than the original. You're given 6 debatably extreme sports to compete in, with the goal of trying to get the highest score. Oh, well, wait a minute. Well, I see the first problem with the Genesis port. Instead of the original 6 sports, there's only 5 here. Still remaining in the game are half-pipe, aka skateboarding, BMX, roller skating, footbag, and surfing, but frisbee has been cut. Personally, if I was going to cut one of the 6, I would have cut you know what, I can't call it that. It's freaking hacky sack. For the rest of the review, I'm calling it its proper name, hacky sack. So, anyway, if I was going to cut one of the sports, it probably would have been hacky sack, but I can see why they chose to cut frisbee. But this brings up a bigger question. Why did Novotrade, who Sega had developed the game for them, need to cut any of the sports at all? I mean, this is the beefy Sega Genesis we're talking about here, not the Commodore 64, the NES, or even the Master System. Perhaps they couldn't fit it in the 4 megabit cartridge they were using, but really, this was late 1991 we're talking about. I've got a hard time giving a game a pass because it couldn't fit into 4 megabits at that point. Losing one sport isn't the end of the world, but it's certainly not helping my view of the game. Let's move on to look at the individual sports that did make the conversion though. First up is halfpipe. Halfpipe consists of skateboarding up and down a halfpipe while you attempt to score the most points you can in 80 seconds. However, Tony Hawk, this is not. The only tricks you can pull off are hand plants, turns, and switching between the front portion of the pipe to the rear. Pulling off tricks or just staying on your board can be slightly frustrating at first until you get the timing down. By default, there's not really much to halfpipe, but the game does offer the option to have 2 players run the pipe at the same time if you don't mind losing the track switching tricks. After halfpipe comes hacky sack. If you've never played hacky sack, the goal of the game is to keep a small, tightly bound beanbag in the air using anything but your hands. Think of it as similar to practicing juggling a soccer ball, but with much less energy potential, so you don't have to worry about the sack going too far away. As far as the California Games implementation is concerned, there's a multitude of tricks that you can pull off while juggling the sack, depending on what part of your body is used to keep the sack in the air, and if you are facing forward or backward at the time. The longer the sack is kept in the air, the more points you can accumulate. Like with halfpipe, the option has been added to have 2 jugglers at once, and they can either share the same sack or each try to juggle at the same time. And there's also been the option added for moon gravity, which results in lower scores, but having more time to maneuver while the sack is in the air. Next is surfing. Surfing is relatively simple. Try to stay on your board while riding the waves, and assuming you can generate enough speed, you can jump off the wave and attempt to perform a spin with the goal of being able to land the jump just right so that you don't wipe out. While you're on the wave, you can slow down to get under the curl and attempt to take out rogue beach balls that have floated into the wave. Surfing is kind of like halfpipe. There's not really a ton to do here, so once you learn the timing of the jumps and spins, you're probably just going to be doing as many as you can in the time given. To mix things up, there are 3 different surfboards that can be chosen in the options that will affect how the event is played, so that's nice. It seems like so far there's a pattern of trying to add features to each of the events to make the Genesis version stand out from the other ports. Well, that ends with roller skating. Both roller skating and BMX have no additional options, so if you played them on the other versions of the game, you know what to expect. For roller skating, you've taken control of a girl that's just trying to get from one end of the beach to the other on the sidewalk, but in your way are various hazards like sand, cracks in the pavement, beach balls, and other skaters going the opposite way. Roller skating is pretty straightforward, and you do better at the event the more you play and learn where the various obstacles are in the course. BMX is pretty much the same as roller skating. You're biking on a BMX bike down a dirt course that has all sorts of logs and rocks that can get in your path, and your goal is not just to get to the end of the course safely, but to also try to pull off one of two tricks when you can, a backflip or a horizontal 360-degree turn. Like roller skating, learning the course is important, and also learning where it's safe to pull tricks off at, and where it should be avoided, because if you take too many risks, your day will probably be over early. And honestly, that's about it. As mentioned before, you can play with up to 8 other players via passing the controller around, and you can choose whether to play through the entire set of 5 events, or select just a few events that you like, or even just one event. And of course you can practice each of the events, so that you can be somewhat prepared for entering a competition. But there's no overarching tournament aspect to the game, and there's no trying to see who can place highest in all the events to find a grand champion, which seems to be a bizarre thing to cut out from the game. It's just each player trying to get a high score, and if it's high enough, put their name into the high score table. In a port that came out so much later than all the other editions, I was certainly expecting more, not less. I do appreciate how the additional gameplay tweaks for half-pipe, hacky sack, and surfing were added to the game, but with the removal of choosing a clothing sponsor company to represent at the beginning, which was similar to picking a country in the other titles in the game series, and the removal of Frisbee as an event, and the removal of determining a grand champion, it really just seems like the gains don't necessarily make up for the losses. And I still question why anything had to be lost at all, as, again, the Genesis version came out 5 years after the Commodore 64 original. If anything, this should have been a bigger, badder director's cut of California games. Just think what this game could have been had it had more sponsors, computer-based opponents, events from California Games 2, hell, even just adding a battery backup so that the only actual point of the game, the high scores, could have been saved between playing sessions. I mean, am I crazy here? How do we get a port of a game 5 years after the original that has a net loss of features? I haven't mentioned much about the graphics and sound in California Games so far, and that's because they're just okay. It's certainly the best looking and sounding of any of the ports of the game, but that's not really saying much, and when you compare it to those other versions, well, there's nothing screaming 16-bit powerhouse here. In fact, other than some cleaned up animations and additional detail here and there, not much has changed over the years. I wouldn't classify anything in the game as looking or sounding bad, and I did enjoy the background music, but anyone looking for impressive graphics and sound in their extreme sports title should be looking elsewhere. California Games for the Genesis is disappointing to say the least. Maybe I would have liked it better had I not already played it extensively on other platforms previously, but there's just not much here that hasn't already been done elsewhere before. I could see this being mildly amusing in a multiplayer scenario, and I do like how they did try to add a few extra options to attempt to keep things fresh, but honestly, I would have preferred they kept the game exactly the same, not adding anything new, and then not cutting any material out. I get the feeling releasing this game was a total cash grab on Sega's part, and they were probably able to license the rights to the game from Epyx dirt cheap at that point, due to them being almost out of business. As a result, I'm giving California Games on the Genesis 2 stars, but due to its brevity and the other issues I listed, if you wanted to only give it 1 star, I think that's totally fair. Very curious to eventually review the Master System version in another 100 episodes or so, because I've got a feeling I'm going to think it's the better version. We shall see.
Okay, that was California Games for the Genesis. I had such high hopes for this game, and it just feels so incredibly cheap and dated. There's just not really a good version for this game to exist, other than to make money off the cash cow of California Games that had already been sucked pretty dry. I will say this, if you've never played any version of California Games, and you come across a cheap copy of the game, and you enjoy multiplayer competitive titles, pick it up, as I do think it's worth messing with for a bit, and everyone should experience California Games in some form. But if you've already got a copy of it on some other platform, the slightly improved graphics and additional gameplay options aren't worth seeking this out. Tune in next week as it's time to go back to the Master System for a spell. Quite literally in the case of next week's title. And I know probably the first game you were thinking with that hint was Spellcaster, but no, not that one. This game is far more well known on the Genesis, and I did actually already review that version on the channel. I'm somewhat curious as to how this version has held up, as somewhat controversially, I don't love the Genesis game, and I'm sure there's going to be some elements missing from the original to cram it into 8 bits. Hopefully nothing too important, but I guess I'll find out. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 170. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.